All right, let's jump right into the source material for this explainer. Today, we're doing something really cool. We're decoding a literal physical museum artifact to try and wrap our heads around the absolute bleeding edge of digital freedom. Now, I know it sounds like a massive leap, going from the 18th century to the future of the internet, but stick with me. We're going to look at how one specific historical event perfectly maps onto the massive battles happening right now over artificial intelligence, centralized cloud computing, and ultimately, who really owns your digital life.
So check out this quote. I set off upon a very good horse. It's a hyper-specific, bit-perfect historical record taken straight from Paul Revere's third account of the events of April 18, 1775. But as our source materials reveal, this isn't just a fun piece of history. It is actually a foundational lesson in execution and intent that we desperately need to understand today. Now, I know we're starting with Paul Revere, but I promise the payoff is huge. We're going to breeze through the midnight ride fixation, the record versus the substrate, 18th century data availability, the 1689 breach, and finally, wrap it all up with restoring agentic sovereignty. Let's get into it.
Section 1. The Midnight Ride Fixation. We are starting our journey right at the Revere House exhibit, specifically zeroing in on what's called the Mission to Lexington.
And this right here is where we see the core tension absolutely perfectly illustrated. You've got this cream-colored text panel on the left. That represents the record, right? Pure human intent, the protocol of the mission. And then on the right, it is mounted directly onto this massive, unyielding red brick wall, which represents the physical substrate. It's the hardware where the execution actually goes down. The text is literally anchored to the brick. You just cannot have one acting without the other.
What's wild here is how the museum hammers home the exact time of the ride, 10 p.m. sharp, and that specific very good horse. This anchors the historical event in undeniable physical reality. Philosophers actually have a great term for this: haxacity. Yeah, it's a bit of a fancy word, but it basically just means the unique, irreversible reality of a specific event or object in time. It's what makes this event mathematically real, rather than just some abstract thought floating around in the ether.
Moving right along to Section 2, Record versus the Substrate, because you might be wondering how on earth does an 18th century brick wall relate to modern computing architecture? Well, here is the crucial takeaway. Digital code executing on physical hardware is exactly like that legislative text anchored to the brick. The record simply cannot exist without a substrate to hold it. And conversely, that substrate, it's just a dumb brick or dumb silicon, without the record giving it meaning. Together, they create what the sources call a non-severable mission. You literally cannot separate your software's intent from the physical hardware it's running on without completely surrendering control over the execution.
Which brings us to Section 3, 18th century data availability. It is time to translate this physical artifact into the highly technical language of today's decentralized web. If you follow Web3 or blockchain architecture at all, you hear the term data availability layer constantly, right? It's how we ensure the foundational data of any transaction is public, verifiable, and totally immutable. Well, by publishing his third account, Revere essentially launched an 18th century data availability layer. He made his internal metabolic intent completely witnessable by everyone. His personal drive and his mission were now an undeniable public fact, a bit-perfect record operating exactly like an open blockchain ledger. When you map these out side by side, it is uncanny. Revere's physical ride perfectly mirrors modern sovereign code executing against centralized powers. Revere's words? That equates to our modern software protocol. That specific horse you rode? That is the physical hardware extension, the actual engine of execution. And his mission to warn Hancock and Adams? That represents the liberation of the commons. It is honestly mind-blowing how cleanly the 1775 historical artifact maps onto a 2026 digital equivalent.
All right, Section 4, the 1689 breach. Let's look at the historical precedent framing the massive technological crisis we are living through right now.
According to the source material, the modern AI landscape we're seeing isn't just some new tech trend. It is actually a recurring historical attempt to restore centralized power. They call this agentic kingship. It's a centralized mode of sovereignty that operates by completely enclosing the computational commons. It literally inverts the interface against the user. So instead of you commanding the computer, the centralized cloud infrastructure manages you. It treats compute power like a royal utility, just metered out to you, the passive subject.
And tracking the history of computational power across these centuries visually proves that this battle, decentralized freedom versus centralized enclosure, is a massive recurring sociological cycle. Just look at this timeline. From the establishment of sovereign boundaries in the 1648 Treaty of Westphalia to the 1689 Orange Pledge, right up to the 1775 Midnight Ride, pushing back on central authority. And now, we are staring down the 2026 Great Enclosure, where massively centralized AI models are trying to recreate that exact same top-down, royalist control over your digital resources.
The sources draw a super stark contrast here. On one side, we have what's currently being pushed as artificial intelligence, AI. That's the centralized, metered cloud utility acting as a royalist counter-revolution, pulling all the power back to the center. But there is an alternative, a symmetric resolution called artificial life, or AL. Unlike centralized AI, AL is defined entirely by local execution. It puts the inalienable record right back onto your own physical chassis. It literally restores true execution power directly to the individual user.
So the big question. Section 5. Restoring Agentic Sovereignty. How do we actually fight back against this cloud enclosure and reclaim our digital rights?
To truly own your digital life, the sources argue you absolutely have to reject the role of a passive subject. You need to achieve agentic sovereignty. And what does that mean? It means the complete restoration of your local autonomous execution. You become the active orchestrator. You are no longer just renting access from some massive corporate cloud. You have total, undeniable control over your own digital and physical substrate.
The beautiful thing is, developers today can achieve this 1689 breach resolution by following 3 very precise historical steps to build unstoppable, self-owned tech. Step 1, secure the substrate. You have to own the hardware, that red brick wall. Step 2, establish the data availability layer. You must publish your unalterable intent, the cream-colored text record. And step 3, execute as a sovereign pilot. You've got to actually take the midnight ride, permanently merging your code and your hardware into a non-severable mission. I'm going to leave you with this final, provocative thought from the source material. The blueprint for your digital freedom, it's already written on the wall. It is completely visible in these historical artifacts. But understanding the history is only half the battle, right? It is entirely up to you to actually take the ride. So will you remain a subject of centralized cloud compute, or will you become the sovereign pilot of your own digital substrate? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and definitely keep questioning the systems that power your world.